The imperial palace of Zephyria Prime stood like a crystalline mountain against the purple sky, its towers reaching toward the three moons that cast an eerie glow across the capital city. Within its halls, the most powerful beings in the galaxy walked with careful steps, their voices hushed in reverence and fear. The Zephyrian Empire controlled over 2,000 star systems, commanded fleets that could crack planets, and ruled with an iron fist that had never known defeat. But today, even the mightiest of the Emperor's advisors trembled. Princess Lyrelei, the Emperor's only child and heir to the throne, lay dying in the highest tower of the palace. The 12-year-old Zephyrian had fallen ill 3 months ago with a mysterious disease that baffled every physician, scientist, and healer in the Empire. Her once brilliant silver skin had turned a sickly gray, her forearms hung limp at her sides, and her usually bright purple eyes had dimmed to the color of old bruises. The Emperor Vorthak himself, a being whose very presence could make seasoned warriors faint, paced the corridors outside his daughter's room like a caged beast. His massive frame, standing nearly 9 feet tall, cast long shadows on the polished floors. His 6 arms moved restlessly, one pair clenched into fists, another adjusting his ceremonial armor, and the third scratching nervously at the ridge of bone that crowned his head. "Any word from the medical team?" He growled at his chief advisor, a thin Zephyrian named Keltus who had served the royal family for decades. Keltus bowed his head, his own 4 arms trembling slightly. "My lord, they have tried everything. The quantum healers from the Andromeda sector, the biomanipulators from the Crab Nebula, even the mystical practitioners from the old worlds. Nothing works. The princess grows weaker each day." The Emperor's roar of frustration echoed through the palace, causing servants and guards to press themselves against the walls in terror. Several priceless artifacts shattered from the force of his voice alone. In the 3 centuries of his rule, Vorthak had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with either overwhelming force or unlimited resources. Yet here he stood, helpless as his beloved daughter faded away. "Summon more specialists," he commanded. "Contact every world in the Empire. Offer any price, any reward. I will give half my kingdom to whoever can save her." "My lord," Keltus said carefully, "we have already reached out to every known medical authority. Perhaps it is time to consider that some things are beyond our control." The temperature in the corridor seemed to drop several degrees as the Emperor fixed his advisor with a stare that could have melted steel. "Never say that again," he whispered, his voice more terrifying in its quietness than any roar. "My daughter will live. Find another way." As the weeks passed, the palace became a parade of the desperate and the ambitious. Renowned doctors arrived from the farthest reaches of the galaxy, each promising miracles, each leaving in defeat. Miracle cures were attempted, ancient rituals performed, and experimental treatments that pushed the boundaries of known science were tried. Nothing worked. The princess continued to waste away, her condition becoming more dire with each passing day. She could barely speak now, her voice reduced to a whisper, and she spent most of her time unconscious. The few moments when she was awake, she would ask for her father with such heartbreaking hope that even the hardened palace guards would turn away to hide their tears. The Emperor became increasingly unstable, his rage alternating with periods of devastating grief. He executed 3 doctors who had promised too much and delivered too little. He threatened to destroy entire star systems if their medical schools couldn't produce a cure. The Empire itself began to suffer as its ruler's attention turned entirely to his daughter's condition, leaving important decisions unmade and critical policies in limbo. It was during this time of chaos that the palace's head of maintenance, a grizzled Zephyrian named Thorek, made an unusual decision. The cleaning staff had been avoiding the princess's wing of the palace for weeks, terrified of encountering the Emperor, in his current state and equally afraid of witnessing the slow death of the Empire's beloved heir. But there was one cleaner who had volunteered to maintain that section of the palace. Surprisingly, it wasn't a Zephyrian at all, but a human, one of the few members of that peculiar species that served in the palace. Humans were considered barely above animals by most Zephyrians, useful only for menial labor and simple tasks that didn't require the intelligence or physical capabilities of the superior species. This particular human, a middle-aged woman named Sarah Chen, had been working in the palace for nearly 5 years. She was small by Zephyrian standards, standing only about 5.5 feet tall, with the typical 2 arms and 2 legs that marked her species as primitive. Her brown hair was streaked with gray, and her dark eyes held a quiet intelligence that most Zephyrians never bothered to notice. Sarah had requested to clean the princess's wing, much to Thoric's surprise. When asked why she would want such a depressing and potentially dangerous assignment, she had simply said, "Someone should keep it clean for when the princess gets better." Her optimism seemed naive to the Zephyrians, but Thoric was grateful to have anyone willing to take on the task. He granted her request, warning her to stay out of sight and not to disturb anyone of importance. So it was that Sarah Chen, armed with nothing but cleaning supplies and a stubborn human refusal to give up hope, began working in the halls where the Empire's greatest minds had failed. She moved quietly through the corridors, carefully cleaning and maintaining the areas around the princess's chambers, always staying well away from the rooms where the medical teams worked their increasingly desperate experiments. But as the days passed, Sarah began to notice things that others had missed, small details that her human perspective allowed her to see differently, and slowly, very slowly, an idea began to form in her mind, an idea so simple and so radical that it would either save the princess's life or cost Sarah her own. Sarah Chen had always been observant. It was a trait that had served her well during her years working in the Imperial Palace, allowing her to anticipate the needs of her Zephyrian employers and avoid the casual cruelty that many of them displayed toward humans. But now, as she quietly went about her cleaning duties in the princess's wing, her observations were taking on a new significance. The medical teams that came and went from Princess Lyrelai's chambers were brilliant. There was no doubt about that. They wielded technology that could manipulate matter at the atomic level, perform surgeries that lasted for days without the patient feeling pain, and diagnose illnesses that existed only in theoretical models. Sarah watched them from the shadows as they discussed complex treatments in languages that contained mathematical equations instead of simple words. But there was something they all had in common, something that made Sarah's human heart ache with recognition. They were all afraid, not afraid of the Emperor's wrath, though that was certainly a factor. They were afraid of the unknown, afraid of admitting that their vast knowledge and advanced technology might not be enough. This fear made them reach for increasingly complex solutions, each more elaborate than the last. Sarah had seen this before back on Earth, in the early days of human medicine. When doctors didn't understand something, they often tried to solve it with complicated procedures and powerful drugs, sometimes making things worse in their desperation to help. It wasn't until much later that human medicine learned the value of observation, of stepping back and looking at the simple things first. As she cleaned the medical equipment storage room, Sarah overheard 2 Zephyrian doctors discussing their latest failed attempt. They had tried to use nanorobots to repair the princess's cellular damage, but the treatment had only accelerated her decline. "Perhaps we're approaching this wrong," one of them said, his 4 arms gesturing in frustration. "We keep trying to fight whatever is causing this, but maybe we should first understand what her body actually needs." "Impossible," the other replied. "We've run every diagnostic known to science. Her cellular structure is perfect. Her organs are functioning normally. Her brain activity is stable. By all measures, she should be healthy. Then why is she dying?" It was a question that haunted everyone in the palace. Sarah finished cleaning the room and moved on to the next area, but the conversation stuck with her. The doctors were so focused on what was wrong that they weren't looking at what might be missing. That evening, Sarah returned to her small quarters in the servants' section of the palace. Unlike the Zephyrians, who lived in family groups of 10 to 15 individuals, humans were housed individually. Sarah's room was sparse but comfortable, containing a bed, a small desk, and a viewing screen that could access the palace's educational database. She activated the screen and began researching, calling up everything she could find about Zephyrian biology and the specific conditions that affected their royal bloodline. The information was vast and complex, filled with scientific terms that took her hours to understand. But Sarah was nothing if not persistent. She learned that Zephyrians were a highly evolved species that had developed in a unique stellar environment. Their home system contained 3 stars and 7 habitable planets, each with slightly different atmospheric compositions and gravitational fields. The royal bloodline was particularly sensitive to these environmental factors, which was why the imperial palace was built with such precise atmospheric controls. But as Sarah dug deeper into the research, she discovered something interesting. The royal family's sensitivity wasn't just to major environmental factors like gravity and atmosphere. They were also affected by much subtler things: electromagnetic fields, mineral concentrations in the air, even the presence of certain organic compounds. Sarah's human background suddenly became an advantage. Humans had evolved on a single planet with a relatively simple ecosystem, but they had also developed a remarkable ability to notice patterns and connections that other species might miss. Where Zephyrians saw separate, unrelated systems, humans often saw interconnected webs of cause and effect. She began to notice patterns in the princess's condition that the advanced medical scanners had missed. The princess seemed to have good days and bad days, but there didn't seem to be any medical reason for the variation. Sarah started keeping a simple chart, marking down the princess's condition each day as reported by the medical staff. After 2 weeks of careful observation, a pattern emerged. The princess's worst days always coincided with certain activities in the palace. Specifically, when the quantum generators that powered the building's defensive systems were running at full capacity. Sarah's heart began to race as she researched quantum generators and their effects on biological systems. Most species were completely unaffected by the electromagnetic fields they produced, but there were a few documented cases of sensitive individuals experiencing cellular disruption when exposed to certain frequencies. The royal bloodlines' enhanced sensitivity could make them particularly vulnerable to this kind of interference, and if the princess had been exposed to these fields for months while already weakened by illness, it could explain why she continued to deteriorate, despite all the medical intervention. But Sarah faced a problem. She was just a human cleaner. If she tried to approach the medical team with her theory, they would either ignore her completely or have her punished for presuming to question their expertise. If she somehow managed to get the emperor's attention, he might kill her on the spot for suggesting that his own palace was making his daughter sicker. Yet Sarah couldn't remain silent. Every day that passed, the princess grew weaker. The entire empire was in chaos, and innocent people were suffering because their ruler was consumed with grief and rage. If there was even a chance that Sarah's theory was correct, she had to find a way to test it. She began to watch the patterns more carefully, correlating the princess's condition not just with the quantum generators, but with every major system in the palace. She tracked power fluctuations, atmospheric adjustments, and even the movement of the palace's defensive shields. The correlation became undeniable. Every time the palace's most advanced systems operated at peak efficiency, the princess suffered. It was as if the very technology that was meant to protect her was slowly killing her. Sarah realized she would need proof. Solid, undeniable evidence that even the arrogant Zephyrian medical teams couldn't dismiss. She would have to find a way to document the connection between the palace's systems and the princess's condition in a way that would force them to listen. But first, she would need to get closer to the princess herself, close enough to make detailed observations that the medical equipment might have missed. It was a dangerous plan that could cost her everything, but Sarah had made her decision. Sometimes the most important discoveries came from the most unlikely sources, and sometimes it took an outsider's perspective to see what was hiding in plain sight. Getting closer to Princess Lirelai would require more than just determination. It would require careful planning and a healthy dose of human ingenuity. Sarah spent several days observing the routines of the medical staff, noting when they took breaks, when they changed shifts, and when the princess's chambers were left with minimal supervision. The opportunity came during the 3rd week of Sarah's investigation. A new team of specialists had arrived from the Proxima cluster, bringing with them an experimental treatment that required the princess to be moved to a specialized medical bay 3 floors down from her regular chambers. The move would take several hours and would leave her original room empty for the first time in months. Sarah knew this might be her only chance to conduct a thorough examination of the princess's environment. She waited until the medical procession had departed, then slipped into the chambers with her cleaning equipment as a cover. The princess's room was a marvel of Zephyrian engineering and artistry. The walls were made of a living crystal that could change color and opacity at will, currently set to a soft, healing blue. The air itself was precisely controlled, with humidity, temperature, and atmospheric composition maintained to exacting standards. Medical equipment lined the walls, their displays showing streams of data that would have overwhelmed most beings. But Sarah wasn't looking at the obvious things. She was searching for the subtle environmental factors that the sophisticated medical equipment might have overlooked. Using a small scanning device she had borrowed from the maintenance department, she began taking readings throughout the room. The electromagnetic signature was immediately apparent. The room was saturated with fields from a dozen different sources: the medical equipment, the palace's defensive systems, the communication networks, and the quantum processors that managed the building's environmental controls. For most beings, these fields would be undetectable and harmless, but for someone with the royal bloodline's enhanced sensitivity, it would be like trying to sleep inside an electrical storm. Sarah documented everything, taking detailed readings and noting the position of every piece of equipment. She discovered that the medical devices themselves were contributing to the problem. Their constant monitoring and treatment protocols generating additional electromagnetic interference that was slowly poisoning the princess, but the most damning evidence came when Sarah checked the room's position relative to the palace's main power core. The princess's chambers were located directly above one of the quantum generators, close enough that the field emissions would be at their strongest. It was the perfect location for security and symbolic importance, but the worst possible place for someone with the royal family's unique physiology. Sarah was so absorbed in her work that she almost missed the sound of approaching footsteps. She quickly concealed her scanning equipment and resumed her cleaning duties just as a palace guard entered the room. "What are you doing here, human?" the guard demanded, his forearms reaching for his weapons instinctively. "Cleaning, sir," Sarah replied respectfully, keeping her eyes downcast. "Maintenance Chief Thorek assigned me to keep the princess's chambers ready for her return." The guard looked around the room suspiciously, but Sarah's cleaning supplies and submissive demeanor seemed to satisfy him. "Be quick about it," he growled. "The medical team will be back soon and they don't want any disruptions." Sarah finished her work quickly and left the chambers, her mind racing with the implications of what she had discovered. She now had solid evidence that the palace's own systems were contributing to the princess's illness, but she still faced the enormous challenge of getting someone to listen to her. That evening, Sarah made a decision that would have seemed insane to any rational being. She would approach the Emperor directly. It took her 2 days to work up the courage and plan her approach. The Emperor was currently spending most of his time in the medical bay where his daughter was being treated, maintaining a vigil that had lasted for weeks. Security around him was intense, but Sarah had noticed that there was a brief window each evening when he would walk alone through a particular corridor, lost in thought and grief. Sarah positioned herself in that corridor with her cleaning equipment, timing her presence to coincide with the Emperor's nightly walk. When the massive figure of Orthak appeared at the far end of the hallway, Sarah's courage almost failed her. The Emperor in person was even more intimidating than she had imagined, his 6 arms moving with restless energy, his eyes burning with barely contained rage and sorrow. As he approached, Sarah did something that went against every survival instinct she possessed. She stepped directly into his path and dropped to her knees, her head bowed in submission. "Your Imperial Majesty," she said, her voice steady despite her terror, "I believe I know what is making Princess Lyralee sick." The Emperor stopped so abruptly that the air itself seemed to freeze around him. For a moment, Sarah was certain she was about to die. The temperature in the corridor dropped noticeably, and she could feel the weight of his gaze like a physical force pressing down on her. "You," he said, his voice like distant thunder, "you are the human cleaner." "Yes, Your Majesty. And you think you know something that the greatest medical minds in the galaxy have missed?" Sarah raised her head slightly, meeting his eyes for just a moment before lowering her gaze again. "I think I know why the treatments aren't working, Your Majesty. I think the palace itself is making her sicker." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears, and she was acutely aware that her life now hung by the thinnest of threads. The Emperor could kill her with a single gesture and no one would question his decision. Instead, he spoke. "Explain." Sarah took a shaky breath and began to present her findings. She explained her observations about the correlation between the princess's condition and the palace's systems. She described the electromagnetic readings she had taken and their potential effects on the royal bloodline's enhanced physiology. She presented her theory clearly and concisely, sticking to facts and avoiding speculation. When she finished, The Emperor stared at her for a long moment. Then, to her amazement, he did something she had never seen him do before. He laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the bitter, hollow laughter of a being who had just realized that the solution to his greatest problem might have been hiding in plain sight all along. "A human," he said, shaking his massive head. "A human cleaner notices what doctors and scientists with centuries of training could not see." "Your Majesty," Sarah said carefully, "I may be wrong, but if there's even a chance that I'm right, shouldn't we test it?" The Emperor's expression grew thoughtful. For the first time in months, there was something other than rage and despair in his eyes. There was hope. "Yes," he said slowly, "we will test it. But if you are wrong, human, if you have given me false hope in my darkest hour, there will be consequences beyond your imagination." Sarah nodded, accepting the threat as inevitable. "I understand, Your Majesty. But if I'm right, the princess can be saved." The Emperor turned and began walking toward the medical bay, his massive stride forcing Sarah to hurry to keep up. "Then let us discover which of us will live to see tomorrow," he said grimly. As they walked through the corridors of the Imperial Palace, Sarah realized that she had crossed a line from which there could be no return. She had committed herself to a path that would either save the princess and vindicate humanity's worth, or result in her own destruction. But for the first time since she had begun her investigation, she felt truly hopeful. Sometimes the most complex problems had the simplest solutions. And sometimes it took an outsider's perspective to see what everyone else had missed. The medical bay fell silent as Emperor Vorthak entered with the small human cleaner, walking nervously beside him. The assembled team of doctors, specialists, and technicians, representing the finest medical minds from across the galaxy, turned to stare in bewilderment at the unprecedented sight. Dr. Zelthan, the lead physician from the Proxima cluster and current head of the princess's medical team, was the first to recover from his shock. His forearms gestured in confusion as he approached the Emperor. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing respectfully, "we were not expecting you to bring visitors to the medical bay. The princess's condition is quite delicate, and we must maintain strict protocols." The Emperor's 6 eyes fixed on the doctor with an intensity that made the medical equipment nearby flicker. "This human believes she has identified the cause of my daughter's illness. You will listen to what she has to say." A ripple of disbelief passed through the medical team. Dr. Zelthan's skin shifted to a deeper shade of blue, indicating his distress. "Your Majesty, with all due respect, we have consulted with thousands of specialists, run millions of diagnostic tests, and attempted treatments that push the very boundaries of known science. I hardly think a primitive cleaning servant could—" "I think," the Emperor interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "that your thousands of specialists and millions of tests have accomplished nothing except watching my daughter grow weaker each day. Perhaps it is time to try a different perspective." Sarah stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she activated the small scanning device she carried. "Your Majesty, doctors, if I may demonstrate." She moved toward the princess's treatment bed, where the young heir lay unconscious, surrounded by a forest of monitoring equipment and treatment devices. Even in the medical bay, the electromagnetic readings were significant, though slightly lower than in her regular chambers. "Princess Lyrale's bloodline makes her exceptionally sensitive to environmental factors," Sarah began, her voice growing stronger as she focused on the science rather than the intimidating audience. "But that sensitivity includes electromagnetic fields that most medical equipment doesn't monitor, because they don't affect normal patients." She held up her scanner, showing the readings to the assembled medical team. "The palace's systems, including much of your medical equipment, are generating field interference that's disrupting her cellular processes at a quantum level. Every treatment you've attempted has been fighting against this constant source of damage." Dr. Zelthan examined the scanner with obvious skepticism. "Even if such fields existed at detectable levels, which our equipment would have registered, the effects you're describing are purely theoretical. There's no documented evidence of electromagnetic sensitivity in the royal bloodline." "Actually," said a quiet voice from the back of the medical team, "there is." All eyes turned to Dr. Myril, an elderly Zephyrian physician who specialized in historical medicine. She had been brought in to consult on ancient treatments and traditional remedies when the modern approaches failed. Dr. Myril stepped forward, her movements slow but deliberate. The old medical text mentioned something called palace sickness among the royal families of the pre-technological era. Members of the royal bloodline would sometimes fall ill when they spent too much time in the great crystal palaces of ancient Zephyria. The condition was always mysterious and often fatal. She paused, her ancient eyes focusing on Sarah with new respect. The text described symptoms very similar to what we're seeing in Princess Lorelei. Weakness, cellular degradation, progressive organ failure despite the absence of any detectable disease. The condition only affected those of royal blood, and it only occurred within the great palaces. Superstitious nonsense, Dr. Zelton declared. Ancient Zephyrians attributed many natural phenomena to mystical causes. There's no scientific basis for... The ancient palaces were built from resonant crystals, Dr. Myrle continued, ignoring the interruption. Crystals that generated natural electromagnetic fields as part of their defensive systems. If this human is correct, then our modern technological version of those same defensive fields could be causing the same condition. Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward the elderly doctor. Dr. Myrle is right. Your historical records show that palace sickness disappeared when the royal families moved to traditional stone buildings during the classical period. It only returned when the modern crystal palaces were rebuilt with advanced technological systems. The emperor had been listening intently, his massive frame looming over the medical team. Then the solution is simple, he said. We remove my daughter from the palace. Your Majesty, Dr. Zelton protested. Moving the princess in her current condition could be fatal. The stress of transportation, the disruption of her treatment protocols, the exposure to uncontrolled environments, it's far too dangerous. More dangerous than leaving her here to die slowly? The emperor asked coldly. Sarah cleared her throat nervously. Actually, Your Majesty, there might be a safer way to test the theory first. We could temporarily shut down the palace's quantum systems and create an electromagnetically clean environment around the princess. If my theory is correct, we should see improvement within a few hours. Impossible. Admiral Kirek, the palace's chief of security, spoke up from his position near the medical bay's entrance. The defensive systems cannot be deactivated. The palace would be vulnerable to attack. The entire empire is vulnerable while I'm distracted by my daughter's condition, the emperor replied sharply. How many rebellions have started while I've been focused on her illness? How many systems have declared independence while their emperor appeared weak? Admiral Kirek's skin flushed a deep purple. Your Majesty, I understand your concerns, but... No, the emperor said, raising one of his 6 hands for silence. We will test the human's theory. Admiral, you will coordinate with the technical staff to create a localized field dampener around the medical bay. Dr. Zelton, you will monitor my daughter's condition and document any changes. Dr. Myrle, you will assist in any way possible. He turned to Sarah, his expression unreadable. And you, human, will remain here to observe the results of your theory. If you are correct, you will be rewarded beyond your imagination. If you are wrong, he didn't need to finish the threat. Sarah nodded, accepting her fate whatever it might be. The next few hours were a flurry of activity as the palace's technical staff worked to create an electromagnetic dead zone around the medical bay. It was a complex process that required careful coordination between multiple departments and the temporary rerouting of several critical systems. As the field dampeners came online, the medical equipment's displays began to change. The constant background readings that had remained stable for months started to fluctuate in ways that hadn't been seen since the princess first fell ill. Her cellular activity is increasing, Dr. Zelton reported, his voice filled with disbelief. Neural activity is stabilizing. I'm seeing improvements across all major indicators. Sarah watched the monitoring displays with growing excitement and relief. The princess's vital signs were strengthening with each passing minute, her body finally free from the constant electromagnetic stress that had been slowly killing her. After 6 hours, Princess Lorelei opened her eyes for the first time in 2 weeks. Father, she whispered, her voice weak but clear. The emperor, who had maintained his vigil beside her bed throughout the entire process, dropped to his knees beside his daughter's bed. For the first time since Sarah had known him, the mighty ruler of the galaxy wept. I'm here, my little star, he said softly, taking her small hand in one of his massive ones. You're going to be all right. As the medical team celebrated and the emperor held his daughter, Sarah quietly slipped toward the back of the room. Her work here was done. and she had no desire to intrude on the royal family's private moment. But she had taken only a few steps when the Emperor's voice stopped her. "Human," he called out. "Sarah Chen, come here." Sarah approached hesitantly, unsure of what to expect. The Emperor looked up at her from beside his daughter's bed, his expression complex and unreadable. "You have given me back my daughter," he said simply. "Ask for any reward and it shall be yours." Sarah considered carefully before answering. She could ask for wealth, for status, for her own ship and the freedom to explore the galaxy. Instead, she said, "Your Majesty, I would like to request that humans be given the opportunity to serve in positions where their unique perspectives might be valuable. We see things differently than other species, and sometimes that difference might be helpful." The Emperor studied her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "It will be done. But that cannot be the extent of your reward. You have saved not just my daughter, but the stability of the entire empire." "Then I would ask," Sarah said, "that you remember this when dealing with other species you consider primitive or inferior. Sometimes the most important insights come from the most unexpected sources." The Emperor's laugh was genuine this time, filled with warmth rather than bitterness. "Human wisdom," he said. "I am beginning to understand why your species has survived, despite being so small and seemingly weak." As Sarah finally left the medical bay, she reflected on the events of the past few weeks. She had risked everything on a sea. 3 months after Princess Lyrale's recovery, the Imperial Palace had undergone remarkable changes that extended far beyond the installation of electromagnetic shielding around the royal quarters. Word of the human cleaner's breakthrough had spread throughout the galaxy, sparking conversations and controversies that reached the highest levels of government and science. Sarah Chen found herself in a position she had never imagined possible. The Emperor had been true to his word, creating the new position of Alternative Perspective Advisor and installing her as the first holder of that title. Her small quarters in the servants' wing had been replaced with a proper office in the administrative section of the palace, complete with research equipment and access to the Empire's vast databases. But the changes went deeper than just her personal circumstances. The Emperor had issued an imperial decree requiring all government departments to include at least one representative from a non-traditional species in their advisory councils. This had caused an uproar among the established Zephyrian bureaucracy, but the results were already beginning to show. Sarah's first major project involved investigating several other mysterious medical cases that had puzzled Zephyrian doctors for years. Working with a small team that included Dr. Myril and 2 other humans who had been brought in from various positions throughout the Empire, she was beginning to identify patterns that the traditional medical establishment had missed. The team had discovered that several supposedly incurable conditions affecting different alien species were actually caused by environmental factors that Zephyrian medical equipment wasn't designed to detect. A plague affecting the aquatic delphinians turned out to be caused by trace chemicals in the water recycling systems of their space stations. A neurological disorder among the crystalline, Fourthen people was linked to vibrations from Standard Starship, engines that resonated with their natural frequencies. "It's not that Zephyrian medicine is bad," Sarah explained to Dr. Myril during one of their weekly research meetings. "It's incredibly advanced and effective for Zephyrian physiology. But when you're treating other species, you need to understand their unique characteristics and vulnerabilities." Dr. Myril nodded, her ancient eyes bright with interest. "The young doctors are starting to understand this. Yesterday, 3 medical students asked me to teach them about historical cross-species medical practices. 5 years ago, none of them would have bothered to learn about primitive treatments. The changes weren't limited to medicine. The Emperor had authorized similar alternative perspective programs in military strategy, engineering, and even economics. A human tactical advisor named Marcus Rivera had identified critical flaws in the Zephyrian fleet's battle formations that made them vulnerable to asymmetric attacks from smaller, more agile vessels. A team of engineers from various species had developed new construction techniques that were more efficient and cost-effective than traditional Zephyrian methods. But perhaps the most significant change was in Princess Lyrale herself. The 12-year-old heir to the throne had made a complete recovery from her illness, but the experience had profoundly affected her worldview. She had insisted on meeting Sarah personally to thank her, And that meeting had led to regular conversations between the princess and her unlikely savior. "Tell me about Earth," Princess Lyrily asked during one of their weekly sessions in the palace gardens. She was sitting cross-legged on the grass, having abandoned the formal posture protocols that normally governed royal behavior. Her forearms gestured enthusiastically as she spoke, her silver skin gleaming in the sunlight. Sarah smiled as she settled beside the princess, marveling at how natural these conversations had become. "What would you like to know about it?" "Everything. How do humans live with only 2 arms? How do you build cities without crystal technology? Why do your people fight so much when you're all the same species?" These sessions had become a highlight of Sarah's new position. The princess was incredibly intelligent and curious, asking questions that forced Sarah to think deeply about humanity and its place in the galaxy. More importantly, these conversations were shaping the future ruler of the empire in ways that could have profound implications for billions of beings. Humans fight because we have different ideas about how to live and organize our societies, Sarah explained. But we also cooperate in amazing ways. When there's a disaster, humans from all over the world will come together to help, even if they were enemies the day before. "That's what you did for me," the princess observed. "You helped even though you didn't have to, even though it was dangerous." "It was the right thing to do," Sarah said simply. The princess was quiet for a moment, then asked, "When I become empress, how can I make sure I don't miss important things the way the doctors missed what was making me sick?" It was a question that went to the heart of governance and leadership, and Sarah chose her words carefully. "I think the key is to listen to everyone, not just the people who are supposed to be experts. Sometimes the most important insights come from unexpected places. Like a human cleaner," the princess said with a grin. "Like anyone who takes the time to observe and think carefully about what they see," Sarah corrected gently. These conversations were being noticed throughout the palace. The princess's tutors reported that she was asking new kinds of questions in her lessons, challenging assumptions that had been taken for granted for centuries. She had requested to learn about the histories and cultures of other species in the empire. Not just Zephyrian achievements. Emperor Vorthak himself had commented on the changes in his daughter during a private meeting with Sarah. "She thinks differently now," he had said. "She questions things that I never thought to question. Perhaps nearly losing her was a gift in disguise. But not everyone in the empire was pleased with the changes. A significant faction of Zephyrian nobles and officials resented the inclusion of inferior species in important decision-making processes. They saw the Alternative Perspective program as a threat to Zephyrian supremacy and the natural order of the galaxy. Admiral Kyrak had been one of the most vocal opponents, though he was careful to phrase his objections in terms of security and efficiency, rather than species prejudice. "These aliens don't understand the complexity of governing an empire," he argued during council meetings. "They lack the intellectual capacity and cultural sophistication necessary for such responsibilities." Sarah had learned to navigate these political undercurrents carefully. She made sure to present her findings and recommendations in ways that emphasized practical benefits, rather than challenging Zephyrian assumptions directly. She worked to build alliances with progressive Zephyrians like Dr. Myril who could help legitimize the changes within their own culture. The breakthrough came when Sarah's team solved a crisis that had been building for months in the Outer Rim territories. Several star systems had been experiencing coordinated rebellions that seemed to anticipate and counter every military response the Empire sent. Traditional intelligence gathering had failed to identify the source of the rebels' information or predict their movements. Sarah suggested a different approach. Instead of trying to infiltrate the rebel leadership or intercept their communications, her team analyzed the timing and nature of the uprisings themselves. They discovered that the rebellions were being coordinated through a network of apparently innocent cultural festivals and trade gatherings that moved from system to system. Throughout the year, the rebels weren't using advanced technology or sophisticated spy networks. They were using the simple human tactic of hiding important information in plain sight, disguising military coordination as cultural celebration. Once the pattern was identified, the Empire was able to disrupt the rebel network without firing a shot, simply by monitoring and regulating the festival schedule. The success earned Sarah's team recognition throughout the Empire and silenced many of their critics. Even Admiral Kirek was forced to admit that the Alternative Perspective program had value, though he did so grudgingly. But the real victory came when Princess Lyrelai announced her intention to spend a year traveling throughout the Empire before ascending to the throne, visiting different worlds and learning about the diverse species under Imperial rule. It was an unprecedented decision that broke with centuries of royal tradition. "I want to understand all of my subjects," she explained to the assembled court. "How can I rule them fairly if I don't know how they live, what they need, and what they can contribute to the Empire?" The announcement caused an uproar among the traditional nobility, but Emperor Vorthak supported his daughter's decision. Looking at Sarah during the announcement, he said, "My daughter has learned the value of seeing things from different perspectives. It is a lesson that will serve her well as a ruler." As Sarah watched the princess field questions from the court about her unprecedented decision, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The changes she had helped set in motion would outlast her own lifetime, shaping the Empire's future in ways that could benefit billions of beings. The small human cleaner who had dared to challenge an Empire's assumptions had become something more, a catalyst for transformation that would echo through the galaxy for generations to come. And it had all started with the simple act of paying attention to what others had overlooked. 5 years after Princess Lyrelai's recovery, the transformation of the Zephyrian Empire had exceeded even Sarah Chen's most optimistic expectations. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save one life had evolved into a fundamental shift in how the galaxy's most powerful civilization approached governance, science, and diplomacy. Sarah stood in her new office in the Imperial Science Complex, reviewing reports from alternative perspective teams across the Empire. The program had expanded far beyond its original scope, with over 10,000 advisors from hundreds of different species now serving in various capacities throughout the Imperial government. The results had been remarkable. The Empire's economic efficiency had improved by 30% as diverse perspectives identified waste and inefficiencies that had been invisible to traditional Zephyrian administrators. Military casualty rates had dropped significantly as human and other alien tactical advisors helped develop strategies that minimized conflict through understanding rather than overwhelming force. Even crime rates had decreased as law enforcement learned to work with local customs and community leaders rather than simply imposing imperial authority. But perhaps most importantly, the number of rebellions and independence movements had plummeted. Systems that had been on the verge of revolt 5 years ago were now stable and prosperous partners in the Imperial Federation. The key had been listening to their concerns and addressing the root causes of their dissatisfaction, rather than simply suppressing the symptoms. Soft chime announced an incoming message on Sarah's communication system. The image of Princess Lyrelai appeared on the screen, though she looked very different from the 12-year-old girl who had been dying in the palace's medical bay. Now 17 and about to ascend to the throne, she had grown into a confident young woman whose silver skin seemed to glow with health and vitality. "Sarah," the princess said, her forearms gesturing with familiar enthusiasm, "I have wonderful news. The Council of Nobles has unanimously approved the diversity accords. Every member world will now have guaranteed representation in the imperial government, regardless of their species or technological level." Sarah felt tears of joy prick her eyes. The diversity accords had been one of their most ambitious projects, a comprehensive reform of the Empire's governmental structure that would formalize the inclusion of all species in the decision-making process. The fact that the traditionally conservative Council of Nobles had approved it unanimously spoke to how much attitudes had changed. "That's incredible news, Your Highness," Sarah replied. "Your father must be proud." The princess's expression grew more serious. "Actually, that's part of why I'm calling. Father has decided to abdicate next month. He says the Empire needs a ruler who truly understands the new age we're entering, and he believes that's me." Sarah wasn't entirely surprised by the news. Emperor Vorthak had been gradually transferring more responsibilities to his daughter over the past 2 years, and his health had been declining recently. But the timing was still shocking. "Are you ready for that responsibility?" Sarah asked gently. "I think so," the princess replied, though Sarah could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "I've learned so much during my travels throughout the Empire. I've seen how different species live, what they need, what they fear, and what they hope for. But Sarah, I want you to be my chief advisor when I become Empress. Sarah was speechless for a moment. The position of chief advisor was traditionally held by a high-ranking Zephyrian noble with centuries of political experience. For a human to hold such a position would be unprecedented in the Empire's history. Your Highness, Sarah said carefully, I'm honored by your confidence, but such an appointment would be extremely controversial. There are many qualified Zephyrians who would be better suited for the role. Qualified in traditional ways, perhaps, the princess replied. But I need someone who will help me see what others might miss. Someone who will challenge my assumptions and remind me to listen to voices that might otherwise be ignored. I need someone who saved my life by paying attention to what everyone else overlooked. Sarah considered the offer carefully. Accepting would mean stepping into the highest levels of galactic politics, with all the dangers and responsibilities that entailed. But it would also mean having the opportunity to influence the direction of an empire that controlled thousands of worlds and billions of lives. If you truly believe I can serve the empire effectively in that capacity, Sarah said finally. Then I accept. The princess's face lit up with joy. Excellent. But there's one more thing. I want to announce the appointment at the same time as I unveil my new title. I've decided that when I ascend to the throne, I won't be called Empress. I want to be called the first speaker of the Imperial Alliance. Sarah raised an eyebrow. The Imperial Alliance? I'm changing the fundamental structure of the government, the princess explained. Instead of an empire ruled by a single species, we're going to become an alliance of equal partners. Each member world will retain its autonomy while contributing to our collective strength and prosperity. The magnitude of what the princess was proposing took Sarah's breath away. She was essentially dissolving the Zephyrian empire as it had existed for over 1,000 years and replacing it with something entirely new, a truly representative, galactic government based on cooperation rather than conquest. The nobles approve this? Sarah asked incredulously. They will, the princess said with quiet confidence. I've been building support for years, working with the progressive factions and demonstrating the benefits of inclusive governance. The economic and social improvements we've achieved have convinced even the most traditional nobles that diversity makes us stronger, not weaker. Over the following weeks, Sarah watched in amazement as the princess's plans unfolded. The transition from empire to alliance was managed with remarkable skill and diplomacy, with the soon-to-be first speaker personally traveling to key worlds to explain the changes and address concerns. The day of the coronation ceremony was unlike anything in the empire's history. Representatives from every member world attended, creating a magnificent display of the galaxy's diversity. Beings of every size, shape, and color filled the great ceremonial hall, from the massive crystalline entities of the Vorthan Collective to the tiny but brilliant insectoid mathematicians of the Kepler swarms. Sarah stood at the princess's side as she took the oath of office, no longer as a subordinate but as an equal partner in leadership. The traditional Zephyrian coronation rituals had been modified to include ceremonies from dozens of different cultures, creating a celebration that belonged to everyone present. Today, the new first speaker announced to the assembled representatives, we begin a new chapter in galactic history. We put aside the old ways of domination and control, embracing instead the strength that comes from unity and diversity. Every voice will be heard, every perspective valued, every species respected as an equal partner in our shared future. The response was thunderous, with beings of every species cheering and celebrating together. But Sarah noticed that the loudest applause came from the Zephyrians themselves, many of whom had tears streaming down their faces as they witnessed their civilization's transformation into something greater than it had ever been before. As the ceremony concluded and the celebration began, Sarah reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. It had started with a dying child and a desperate human cleaner who refused to give up hope. It had grown through the simple recognition that different perspectives could reveal truth that might otherwise remain hidden. Now, that small beginning had blossomed into a fundamental transformation of galactic civilization itself. The Zephyrian Empire had become the Imperial Alliance, a beacon of cooperation and mutual respect that would serve as a model for other civilizations throughout the galaxy. Later that evening, as the celebrations continued throughout the palace, Sarah found herself alone with the first speaker in the same garden where they had held so many conversations. Over the years, do you ever think about how different things might have been if you hadn't decided to speak up that day? The first speaker asked. Sarah smiled, looking up at the three moons that still cast their familiar glow over the capital city. I think about it sometimes, but I've learned that the most important decisions are often the ones that seem impossible at the time. You just have to trust that doing the right thing, even when it's difficult or dangerous, will eventually lead to something good. Human wisdom? The first speaker said with a laugh that echoed her father's words from years before. I hope we never stop learning from it. As they sat together in comfortable silence, Sarah thought about all the humans throughout history who had taken seemingly impossible risks to do what they believed was right. From the first explorers who sailed into unknown oceans, to the scientists who challenged accepted theories, to the ordinary people who stood up for justice when no one else would. Humanity's greatest strength had always been its willingness to question, to explore, and to hope for something better. Now, that strength had helped transform not just one life or one world, but an entire galactic civilization. It was a reminder that no voice was too small to matter, no perspective too humble to contribute something valuable.